We broke this out into a few different areas. We're looking at some cross-app enhancements. We'll dive into the finance and supply chain features, and we'll even talk a little bit about project operations at the end. So looking at this first here with the cross-app enhancements, one of the biggest ones that we've noticed here is with the addition for some saved views. So if you are familiar with what those saved views are, you can go into a form or a grid, and you can add columns, remove columns, reorganize as you see fit, and then you can save that as your own personal view, or you can push it out to additional users at your organization. With that, you clean up your screens, and it is almost like a reporting mechanism that you can utilize within the system. You can really filter down on the data that you need to see, and then have that as a view that you can go into within that form or that grid. So some enhancements that we have now with these saved views, the first one is going to be around dialogues. So with that dialogue feature, you can view, it's going to support dialogues now, which it didn't before. So really the ability to save multiple dialogue views and publish those views out to your users. Next, we have the workspace. So if you log into your D365 environment, you log into your workspace, it has all of those tiles listed for you that you can get into. So now what you have the ability to do is on that workspace page, you can again add and remove some information or some tiles, and then you can actually have multiple saved views directly on your workspace. Next one, we have queries on views on task pages. So this, to allow these queries to be saved to views on a task single and a task double page, it's going to allow you now to filter and sort to be saved to views on, like I said, task single and task double pages. Those are pages with older interfaces that allow you to show and edit data for a single entity and a parent-child entity, respectively. So when you're looking at a form and you have multiple grids, you can now have those saved views per grid within one task page. And then lastly, we have the custom filters. So these are controls modeled on forms that cause modifications to the query. So new APIs are now available to allow custom filters to work more seamlessly with these saved views. Specifically, custom filters can now trigger a view definition to be marked as having unsaved changes, and custom filter controls can listen for system changes to the query to ensure that control value stays in sync with the query. So those are some of the additions to our saved views. Next, we get into vertical scrolling workspaces. Now, if you're very familiar with those workspaces, it's a very wide form, and you're usually scrolling horizontally, right, from left to right. What this has done now is it allows to vertically scroll on those workspaces as well. Next, we get down to the tile sizes for workspaces. So when you are modifying a workspace and you're adding in some filtered forms that you've been working on to that workspace, everything comes in as the same size. That can make it somewhat difficult to manage that workspace and clean it up in a way that is easy to navigate. So with these tile sizes now, we have the ability to do a large, which would be a 4x4, a wide, which is a 2x4, a medium, which is 2x2, and a short, which is 1x2. So you have the ability to do a little bit of cleanup work on those workspaces. Next, we get down to the tabbing behavior. So this is going to improve the usability and accessibility by making it easier and simpler for users to reach all portions of a page. So historically, in the finance and operations apps, users would tab between all the controls in each region of a full page form, such as the navigation bar, maybe your main form, or an action pane. So to move focus to a different region on the page, what you needed to do, you needed to use your mouse or a dedicated keyboard shortcut. This new feature is going to remove these tabbing containers so that a user can tab through all controls on a full page form, regardless of the region they are working in, and without the need for special keyboard shortcuts. And then for cross-app enhancements, the last one I want to review on this slide is going to be to specify data in a data lake. So this is going to enable customers to build rich data integrations and reports using data from both customer engagement apps, CE apps, and finance and operations apps using Azure Synapse Link for Microsoft Dataverse. It will also enable you to optionally include large fields such as memos and an XML string to be exported to your Azure Data Lake storage. And lastly, you can optionally exclude sensitive data such as social security numbers from being exported to the Azure Data Lake storage.
Yeah, there's a lot of great enhancements here, Ted, right? From a cross-app perspective, which the usability for the tiles, I absolutely love. And we share it all the time where people, you know, when you look at a dialogue, for example, when you do like the sales order confirmation, you know, you want to save those queries to it, right? You can now really save really in that view exactly how you would typically run and even the fields that are there now. So that's just a really cool feature in my opinion.
Right, and I think of the workspace too. I mean, there's a lot of workspaces out there specific to your security role that you may not need or may not have to use.
Yeah.
Right, so now you have the ability to remove what you don't need, save that, and you can even push that out to the users, right? So you could have a dedicated workspace for each of the users based on their security role.
Yeah, the tile sizes are another example. Like being able to visually see quickly what is more important on the screen that you're interacting with at a workspace. It makes it so much easier to drive your process. So that I love that they're still working on these cross-app enhancements that affect both finance and supply chain customers, and even then technically commerce and project operation customers, as they just make it easier to use and to get to data.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, so Scott, I'm going to let you take this next slide here and talk a little bit about the Azure Synapse and the other cross-app enhancements.
Yeah, definitely. So just so everyone understands, one of the big initiatives that Microsoft is continuing to tackle here is to make it so that when we look at a Dataverse environment, which is typically Dynamics 365 sales, marketing, customer service, and then we look at Dynamics 365 finance and operations, or what we call the FinOp apps environment that typically tackles finance, supply chain, commerce, and some of the project operations components that are inside of it. Really what we're talking about is data in two different databases, right? We've got Dataverse that stores a lot of that CE, customer engagement or CRM-ish type application data inside of there. And then we've got our old ERP-ish type data that we store then inside of finance and operations. And one of the things that Microsoft has been tackling so that we can get to deeper reporting and productivity inside of your business environment is the fact that we are now able to take that data and basically export it to Data Lake, right? So on that prior slide, the specified data which is exported to Data Lake is a feature now where you can, for example, not have sensitive information. You can have more binary data or note data that you're sending over as part of that. But you still need a way to really report off of that and join that data. And you may want to use Power BI for that. You may want to use Spark. You may want to use SQL Server Management Studio to connect to data and run a query against it, because those are the classical on-premise tools that you're kind of used to. So what Microsoft has been focusing on here with the One Experience for Azure Synapse as an example is to make it so that you can basically go into your finance and operations environment and then export that to Data Lake and then have that Data Lake then connected to an Azure Synapse workspace, very similar to what we do inside of our Dataverse environments. If you've ever gone to the Power Platform, if you go to powerapps.com and then you click on your tables, there's this Synapse link that you see inside of Dataverse where it'll automatically then export the data to a Data Lake in Dataverse, and then from there you can use Synapse to connect to that data inside of an ADLS v2 type storage account. Well, that same concept now is coming over into finance and operations. So this should make it easier for you to be able to export your data to a very low cost storage solution so that you can then use it for any of the other subsequent processes from an enterprise perspective, like your data warehouse or even external application access that you just need to be able to read some of that information with. So a pretty big initiative there from an Azure Synapse perspective. Just want to leave all of you with this. Imagine in the future where we're getting more and more to one environment or one set of data that we use as part of that. So next aspect of it, near zero downtime initiatives that Microsoft is tackling. So part of finance and operations apps is that we have downtime events that occur typically for maintenance operations that we have, right? So those could be updates to the OS that's on the back end. It could be the security, the infrastructure, whatever it is, right? We've got these types of downtime events that we typically have, even like when, for example, going through an upgrade as part of that as well. So what Microsoft really focused on for this was to take some of those particular maintenance updates that are needed and to really reduce the amount of time that it takes to go through and then apply those particular updates, for example, because they want to get to a point where basically we're going to have the ability to really do upgrades without having an impact into your business environment as part of that. So this is more of a newer concept that they started initiating. Obviously, they've been doing it in the back end for a while here. One of the first areas that they looked at is that they basically made it so that you don't have to assign batch jobs to batch servers now. There's a concept called relative scheduling and relative scheduling priorities that are based on the business requirements that allow you basically to take tasks and run them across batch servers as opposed to assigning them. So that way, as you can imagine, you can basically specify a priority against that job. If it's a critical or reserved capacity type job during a maintenance operation, it's going to get basically priority then from a batch perspective to reduce then that downtime, because for some of those maintenance events, they have batch jobs that need to run to be able to really drive that particular process. So this is going to be great to start seeing more of these near zero downtime initiatives really being put into the enterprise finance and operations stack for that. The other area that continues to improve really is in the RSAT tool. So we call it the regression suite automation tool, right? And it's really important because it allows us to produce automated tests that we can really use then to test and upgrade, for example, inside of an environment. So if you're a large enterprise customer and you want to validate when you go through a maintenance event or a wave 1 or wave 2, well, you probably want to use RSAT, obviously, to go through and then test all of that as part of that process. And some of the features that they've enhanced with that. So obviously the improved integration with DevOps. We use DevOps heavily at Stoneridge. You should too. You probably do as well. So the improved capabilities that they've looked at with DevOps is that you're able to now navigate to a lot of the DevOps features using RSAT. Really what that means is that you can actually create new test suites directly in RSAT without leaving the application. And it will actually integrate then into DevOps. So then you can review that as part of the process. So they've really gone through and enhanced that capability to drive that. The other areas that they've looked at then too is like the task recorder. You can validate what are called system controls, like SQL Server reporting services documents, right? Or upload actions that are occurring there. Whereas task recorder before always had to be kind of in that GUI, right? Or in the control structure that you have. Well, they're looking at making it so that some of these system controls as well can be interacted with from that perspective. There's more automation that they've been going through and then adding for this as well as well as doing a concept called test case variants inside of here. So just kind of like our product variants from a functionality perspective, you have test cases, but you may have variations of that. An example would be like, I've got a sales order that I take cash against, but I do the same process and maybe I do a credit card transaction as part of that, right? So these variations allow for us really to use a test case with slightly different inputs, but then to really drive then the variation that we have inside of that particular process. So what I would expect here in the future is that they're going to continue, obviously, to update then and support RSAT, so that when we look at our upgrades, we can use these features now to test more diligently, to actually have task recordings that validate now system controls with it. And really, we can do a lot inside of RSAT now that we couldn't do before, where you had to have DevOps open, for example. You can work in one tool as opposed to move between both of them to really then drive some of that RSAT type improvement that you may need in your organization. So really cool features that affect finance, supply chain, commerce, and then also proj ops from the finance and accounting perspective with it. I think that's all I got, Ted.
Yeah, it's great to see the improvements coming out for RSAT, right? I mean, You think about how many updates are coming through, the 2 wave releases every year. The fact that they're continuing to invest in those testing operations is a good sign.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also other ones. So that, you think about it, we talked about this on Confab even, Ted, like this is the year of integrations. Like they're adding integration testing support inside of RSAT as well now. So, this is the life of the future enterprise, is that it's not like BON, it's not like what we had, 15, 20 years ago where you buy one system to rule them all. You now have really good integrations with other systems that have a very big focus, for example, in finance or field service or whatever it is. And this integration testing is just going to be really critical, obviously, as you go through the process. So it's exciting to see, like you said, Ted.
Okay, so next we got a couple slides here to talk about finance. So this release in the core Dynamics 365 Finance is really focused on bringing additional enhancements to that core financial functionality. So there's a lot of automation. So there's been a big push for automation and insights using a little bit more machine learning on the finance side. So that's what it's really focused on here, that automation around end-to-end business processes, enhanced experiences around things like year-end close, analytical reporting, and then using data in Data Lake, as we mentioned before. So a couple things. There's some features with this wave release that I think really hit on what customers have been asking for years with AX and D365. The first one here is the OCR improvements. So OCR, we're talking about optical character recognition that comes into play with AP automation, right? So what we've seen over the last year or two is Microsoft is pushing some features out there for invoice automation on the AP side. That functionality has been progressively maturing over the past 2 years, but the one thing that's been missing is the OCR components for that, right? So you would get the invoice automation, you still had to go out to a third party to get those OCR capabilities. What Microsoft is doing now is they're trying to now incorporate OCR within native D365. So it kind of brings that functionality all together within one system. So with those OCR improvements, there's going to be some advanced configuration. There's a deployment wizard to get it set up for you. There's an OCR hub, staging area and business rules, and then there's a new OCR data entity. So with some of that advanced configuration, what you can do is you can define mandatory invoice data fields. Really what that does is that defines the minimal data required when creating vendor invoices. Microsoft will provide that default setting, but you can tailor it to your organizational needs by adding or removing some of those fields. You can define the confidence score of invoice recognition. So This defines the quality standard for invoice data to be recognized by AI Builder. So this is some of that machine learning coming into play here. You get the invoice in the system. You want the system to match up that invoice to the purchase order and have it learn over time, right? So when you're thinking about that, you get that invoice in, the system needs to understand where is the PO number on this vendor invoice? Where's the date field on this vendor invoice? Where's the tax information, right? So that AI Builder will learn over time where this information is held based on the vendor invoice that you are receiving. And then you can define mandatory review needed before invoice creation. So that's going to determine whether you have a manual review or if there's going to be more of an automated approval process that goes along with it. So with that feature, it does provide a central place to let recognized invoice data to be validated and processed before being converted to the vendor invoice. There's a staging area that will accept any accuracy level of recognized data from the AI Builder without regard to whether or not the invoice data is complete. And then lastly, we have that new OCR data entity. That's been put in place just to ensure data consistency. The invoice data entity will create vendor invoices as a whole instead of using different data entities to create pieces of that information. So that could be headers, lines, taxes, charges. Tried to include all of that within one data entity. If possible, invoices will be processed automatically during the import phase. If that can be reached, that's going to reduce the manual tasks that must be completed before AP clerks can process invoices with errors or exceptions. Along with the OCR data entity, there will be some new parameters that will be created to support the process of automation when invoices are imported. So a lot of good things there around those OCR improvements. And I would imagine with these next wave releases coming up over the next year or two, there's going to be more enhancements to get that OCR functionality really built out, so you can use all of that within D365. All right, so more finance. The first one is a budget plan upload. So what's going to be provided here is there's going to be some parameters that become available, but it really is going to allow you to mass load budget plans utilizing batch processing. So typically what you do when you create a budget plan is you're using the Open in Excel, which is the OData experience, which can be very time consuming during that publishing process. So as I mentioned, there's a new parameter that's going to be added to the budget layout templates to allow budget plan records to be mass loaded from the budget menu using your batch processing, which really should remove that wait time. The same template can also be published using the OData experience or that Open in Excel option if only a few changes have been made. So it's not an all or nothing thing. You still have the flexibility of using the Open in Excel, but then you do have the option of using that batch processing. And the next one, which is, I think, very exciting, is the subscription billing, right? A lot of organizations are moving to more of a subscription billing model. And natively in the past, D365 or AX did not handle that well. So when an organization has complex pricing and billing practices that can be difficult to manage, this feature should allow greater control over billing per item and contract. And then it lets you automate and evergreen renewals. It enables flexible pricing models, and it's going to improve insight into recurring billing. So with this, you can you can consolidate invoices by the customer if there are multiple billing schedules. You can also consolidate multiple billing schedule lines into a single billing line. So there's going to be that flexible pricing, which is going to be critical to invoicing your customers. Now invoicing through subscription billing can be based on consumption, meter readings, or usage. There's a revenue allocation feature as well within that. So when you're assigning default and standalone selling prices and methods to items, you can calculate the standalone selling price as a percentage of the related item. You can then allocate revenue based on those standalone prices to maintain compliance with the accounting standards. And lastly, you have the revenue and expense deferrals. So advanced revenue recognition lets you manage revenue in compliance with the ASC 606 and the IFRS 15 accounting standards. It's going to enable revenue recognition on document types beyond just sales orders, which is going to allow that control of all of your revenue. So when you're managing deferrals at the line item level, it puts you in control of the revenue recognition process. All right, next we get into the supply chain. So there's three ones specifically that we want to point out here. We have the packing work for packing stations. This is going to improve the flexibility and agility of packing and shipping operations. So during the packing process, warehouse workers are now able to pack and ship individual parcels that are related to the same shipment. That's going to make packing and shipping operations a little bit more effective. Items from the same order do not need to be shipped together if some can be shipped before the other. That same order can then be packed and shipped in multiple parcels at different shipment times if needed. So if you think about what's currently happening within D365, when the warehouse management processes are configured to bring inventory to packing stations, the picking work contains links to those loads. Typically, this can cause issues if you try to split the shipment at load confirmation, because you want to ship just part of that shipment rather than wait for the whole shipment to be processed. So with this packing work for packing stations, it's going to make it possible to create those so-called packing work when inventory lands at the packing station instead of the initial picking work. There's going to be links to load lines that are now carried by the packing work lines. So when that container is closed, the packing work is adjusted so that there is one closed work record per closed container. That should allow the system to easily split the closed containers and move the open containers and remaining picking work into a new shipment of or at ship confirmation.
Mm-hmm.
Next, we have the inventory visibility add-in. I think this is a big one, right? Because a lot of times we have issues understanding our true on-hand inventory. This, with our warehouse-enabled items and the ATP enablement, I think this is really going to allow warehouse users to accurately predict what's going to be on hand and when. So that add-in is going to support on-hand quantity queries for warehouse-enabled items, regardless of whether each item has a warehouse-specific reservation operation. So in a previous release, inventory visibility didn't always correctly calculate on-hand inventory of warehouse-enabled items. So this new feature should be correcting that, and it should accurately calculate for your warehouse-enabled items, just as it does for your non-warehouse-enabled items. The ATP enablement, or the available to promise functionality, provides visibility into future stock levels and can query the next available date for orders. Because of that, that should reduce the risk of losing sales opportunities and overstocking on inventory, which that itself has a pretty large cost impact. It will provide insights into foreseeing potential stock disruptions, and it will give an opportunity to act against those disruptions. You can recalculate inventory based on a specified date and period. So retailers and manufacturers can check inventory for a specified day or ask if the next available dates for products, which is especially useful to support online customer queries and bulk orders. So that ATP functionality is going to let you select a recalculation date for a period when querying inventory on hand. It also lets you check availability when reserving or allocating products. So each time you select a recalculation date and submit a query, the system performs an instance check, and it's going to recalculate the latest inventory changes. That let me say that again, the latest inventory information for the selected date or period transaction statuses, and a calculation will be returned as a result of that query. And lastly, here we have our hazardous material enhancement. So with this, you're now able to get a flashpoint declaration, which you just specify the temperature at which each given material will ignite. This value will be included in the hazardous materials description for the item. You're going to have larger stowage descriptions. So it's really just accepting more characters so you can better describe stowage details. Translations for hazardous material descriptions. So the system can now translate descriptions for each language that is set up for hazardous material language. You'll get a carriage of merchandise by road, which is the CMR report, which is going to support the set emergency response instructions. It will show descriptions for non-hazardous materials in the CRM report. You'll get a container ID, which is now shown for multi-module shipments. So shipments containing hazardous materials can now be tracked by container ID. Your CMR report can now include ADR points. We have a verified gross mass document now provided, which will give you a shipping container BIC ID, a booking number, a trailer number, and a carrier number. And then there are also several other hazardous material reports that have been improved. You have a AITA shipper declaration. It's now going to include more details, including item quantities. A multimodal dangerous goods declaration. It's going to now show item quantities and include a footer with emergency response information. You'll get a shipment summary report, which is going to show the number of packaging instead of the total item quantity. And then there's some usability improvements. So the all loads and the load details and shipment pages now provide links to the relevant hazardous material reports. So a lot of improvements there around inventory visibility and your hazardous material.
Yep.
All right, next for supply chain, we're looking at global inventory accounting add-in and a landed cost third-party integration. So when thinking about the global inventory accounting add-in, there are international organizations are under a lot of pressure from authorities to comply with local and global accounting standards. So the valuation of inventory plays a significant role in securing compliance. So with this new add-in, it's going to provide the ability to account inventory in multiple representations by applying the appropriate valuation method. So standard, cost, average, or specific identification, and the selected accounting currency per instance. So what this is going to do is it allows you to get a definition of multiple costing ledgers. You can work with dual currencies and dual valuations. One big one is the same legal entity can have multiple costing ledgers. And then you get down to your cost object policies. So a costing ledger now can be defined by calendar, currency, exchange rate table, or convention. That convention is a collection of inventory accounting policies that can be associated to one or more ledgers. So that's just going to provide the ability to share a common convention in the organization. It also supports multiple inventory accounting policies. So for each policy, a single rule can be selected, and it's going to apply to all products. So within that, we have the ability to support product, product site, and product site warehouse. There's also a supported input measurement basis policy option, which is going to be a normal, historical, or a standard. You'll get a supported cost flow assumption policy, which allows you to do it based on average, a specific identification, which could be a batch, and then a cost element policy. And then a supported recording interval of perpetual. So this is going to provide a detailed audit trail, which ensures that you can track inventory accounting events and measurements all the way back to the original document posted in supply chain. It does leverage Power BI to provide insights and analytics. And then the shared asset library within your lifecycle services will provide a specifically designed Power BI template that you can download and embed directly into D365.
Yeah, I just want to add a little bit to this, Ted, because this is super exciting. I mean, how many
Right.
times have I heard the question from a manufacturer that I want to have standard costs because I want to manage my variances from production, but I really want to report off of it in FIFO in some way, shape, or form. Um, or any other scenario where you just would like to have just a different costing methodology that you could apply to be able to run this. So this just opens up a lot of possibilities from a comparative reporting perspective when you want to look at the costing by FIFO versus standard versus average as well. I think is what they have. They've got different, like you said, cost element policies that you can apply for really the cost flow assumptions. But the big thing here is that this was a feature that if you were really paying attention to the wave releases, I think it might have actually been 2021 Wave 1 or 2020 Wave 2, where they had this multiple costing ledger concept that they were introducing, and all of a sudden it disappeared. And I was a little bit bummed out about it, Ted, to be honest, because I'd gotten the question so many times where they just want to do some comparisons with different costing methods. And it was nice to see that they added it back into really the scope of work here to be able to do this, because like I said, it's a really nice tool to be able to really analyze your inventory in a different manner as opposed to what your true costing methodology is inside the organization.
Thank you, Scott. And then lastly, some better third-party integration with landed cost. So if you're familiar with what landed cost is, it's a new module recently over the past year or two. It just helps your business streamline inbound shipping operations. And how it does that is provides complete financial and logistical control over imported freight from the manufacturer to the warehouse. So a lot of times, a lot of scenarios we see this is something is getting shipped over on a carrier freight from another country, right? So when that's happening, there's multiple different handoffs and there's multiple costs associated with each of those handoffs. So that landed cost module now is going to support the tracking of those voyages from manufacturer to your site or your warehouse. So with this integration, third-party logistic providers or 3PLs can now submit voyage, container, and folio records. They can update estimated costs, they can track control records, and they can do vendor cost invoice allocations directly to the landed cost module using the transactional entities. So what this does is it saves time, it improves accuracy by ensuring that the information doesn't have to be keyed in manually from the companies using landed cost to manage their inbound process, right? So a lot of times what we've heard in the past is, the functionality is there, this seems to work really well, but there's a maintenance aspect to it, right? We have to manually go in and we have to key this information in. So now with this integration, this should account for some of those gaps or those limitations by allowing those 3PLs to get in there and enter in that information. All right, Scott, I'll let you talk about the catch weight and the planning optimization.
Yeah, so lots of exciting stuff being added from this perspective. If we talk about production floor execution, so you probably saw in the last couple wave releases, we got a new production floor execution screen. And if you haven't seen it, I'd recommend that you check out some of our confabs or our prior webinars that we've had that show it. Really, when you were on AX 2012, we're even at the beginning here when we moved to finance and operations, the job card terminal, right, or device terminal would be used to go through and record production. And quite candidly, it just needed modernization. It wasn't touch oriented. It didn't look good. It didn't support a lot of the extended features as well that we had in the application. So the production floor execution screen was created, and they've come a long way with it. More specifically, being able to post byproducts and co-products in a production floor interaction in a shop floor control scenario was added obviously in the prior release that we had. And now we're starting to see catch weight finally get to other areas inside of the application. So catch weight was a concept that when we moved to our wax and tracks on 2012 R3 that was introduced. It's not used at every organization, but if you are in food, it's pretty common. An example of that is that eggs, you may have a dozen eggs from a quantity perspective, but the weight of those eggs can vary. Or if you do apples, or if you do potatoes, right? And you want to be able to track then weight along with quantity, such as chickens as well, right? We need that catch weight capability. And in a lot of areas, we would have to customize and extend it to be able to support that. So they've added now the catch weight capability inside of our production floor execution, so that we can now record that attribute when we want to register the material or the batch numbers or the serial numbers as part of that. So that will be obviously released then with our 10.026 instance here. So that's going to be a really nice feature to see. The other area that Microsoft has really been working on has been really the removal of the MRP2 engine that we operate today. So most of you know that if you look from a planning perspective, what you'll do is you'll go into your MRP screen, right? You'll run it, and then you'll go into your planned orders. What you don't know is that that MRP engine is kind of archaic and very old in terms of it's not modularized so that it can support some of the more advanced requirements that are really coming down the pike when it comes to a supply chain perspective. So what Microsoft said, I think it was about almost 4 years ago now, is that we're going to build a whole new planning engine inside of the solution so that we can deal with scale and we can modularize it so that way we can add additional features without poking the balloon on one end and having something pop out on the other side of it, right? Any of us that have customized MRP engines know exactly what that means. Net result is that they've been releasing the planning optimization features in waves now with the finance and operations apps in order to decrement or remove the MRP2 engine that we use today. So basically at a high level, they started by tackling the more simple concepts of matching supply and demand together and then making it so that purchase orders could be reordered, for example, where inventory from a production perspective was not integrated with it. Well, in this release, we've had a lot of features that revolve around the planning capability for manufacturers being added into this particular release. So we start talking about subcontracting processing. So if you have outside vendors, we need to generate purchase orders so we can actually take that cost and put it back then to an order. Well, we need to have it plan those. We need shelf life, obviously, for our best buy dates or use by date, for example, that we have inside of our configuration. We need to be able to make sure that capacity now, if we have finite capacity on a resource or a resource group, we don't want to extend, obviously, that resource or resource group because we're using finite capacity to limit that. We need to be able to support make to order and what we call capable to promise as well as part of that. So those features that many of us view as very basic, I think in some ways, if you're a manufacturer, for example, have now been added to the planning optimization, which really almost puts it on par now with the MRP2 engine. So this release really was about taking the more production scheduling centric requirements that are in the MRP engine and then putting them into planning optimization. What does that mean for you on the call? It means that there's going to be a message that's going to pop up when you run MRP that's going to state that they are deprecating or removing that MRP2 functionality, and you're going to want to start looking at the planning optimization process, which is the replacement basically for that. So on the call, just know it's coming. So I'd start planning your organization around how you're going to implement this planning optimization capability. And then lastly, We talked about those additional features now, right? So now that we have a new planning optimization engine in place with it, we can start using some of the more advanced capabilities that we see out in the market that are more towards the best of breed planning solutions that are out there inside of Dynamics. So an example of that, what they call DDMRP, Demand Driven Material Requirements Planning. So really what this allows us to do is to use concepts to like in lean and theory of constraints is typically what I talk to customers around, is that we now have the ability, for example, to take inventory and create, for example, dynamic adjustments into inventory based upon parameters that are not just setup driven. Like an example of that, when you go to your min-max setup that you have, you go to a table and you set that up, right? Well, a lot of systems, what they can do is they can analyze what that requirement has been from a safety stock perspective and adjust it without setting up a minimum key related to it, right? That's a much more advanced concept where it's looking at historical averages to drive basically SLAs that you have then from your safety stock perspective. What it also can do then is that we can tie into then some of those demand-driven type events to influence then really when supply can be satisfied. And what do I mean by that? Well, a purchase order, for example, you'll set up a lead time related to the product, right, for a vendor that says it takes 10 days to get here. Well, we all know that that's never the case, right? Sometimes it's 5 days, sometimes it's 15 days. You need to be able to update that data so that the planning engine knows it, so that it can actually give you proper, supply windows in terms of when you're going to have that product delivered. And all of us know that it's hard to keep up with that amount of data that you then enter into the MRP engine to drive that. Well, imagine now that the MRP engine is smart enough to look at that history, to compute the average amount of days so that the lead time now comes into, for example, that purchase order, and it's been averaged to actually reflect a more accurate number without you having to go into the system and update that. So these are the components really of DDMRP that are being added to allow then those advanced capabilities of buffering, of dynamic adjustment. If you go to the actual planning page for it, it drives into a lot more detail about it. But really, we're looking at now involving some of those more advanced capabilities from an MRP engine that were just kind of impossible from a performance perspective to add. So that way we can have these concepts like decoupled lead times, and we can use those DDMRP net flows to be able to provide those SLAs to really increase the benefits of inventory, of not holding as much inventory from a supply chain perspective. So this is going to be continual, as you can imagine, from a planning optimization perspective. I'd expect that once we get DDMRP, we're going to look at some of the more advanced features that are going to continually be added into here to really focus more of that demand-driven operating model concept that is more typical in modern MRP systems out in the market. So expect a lot of fun around here in the future. Ted, I don't know if I don't have anything more to that, but that's a pretty big thing that they tackled for this release.
Yeah, a lot of buzz around planning optimization, and I can see why.
Yep.
All right.
And then really, Ted, I mean, I guess from a project operation perspective, so remember, one of the cool things about the finance and operations platform is that it is a platform and it's continued to grow in that aspect. Some of us didn't understand why you would separate finance from supply chain at the beginning. Well, we're getting projects now separated from this as well. So the beauty is that for customers that don't have this functionality, they don't have to buy everything up front. They can buy portions of this. And what I would like to stress to the group here today is that expect this to continue just like it's happening on the CE side or our Dataverse side, where we've got sales, field service, and all these other capabilities. So project operations is absolutely worth mentioning in this conversation. Commerce is something as well that we just don't have time for today, but it's got a lot of that functionality too that would be added. The big big things here just to note is that with projects inside of Dynamics, we now use project operations to tackle a lot of those project-based requirements. And project operations is a concept in which you've got two different types of applications that you interact with in order to fulfill the full business process. An example of that, inside of finance and operations, you could argue, and I know a lot of people that view it this way, that the project functionality is great when it comes from the accounting perspective with it, but project managers cannot stand it because it doesn't integrate with project. It doesn't provide a work breakdown structure that's visualized with tasks. It doesn't integrate with Microsoft Project for that matter, other than a very simplistic export from a WBS perspective. So project operations now is getting more emphasis than to be able to drive, for example, then the front end for a project manager, and that's why project operations exists, right? So there are different modes of project operations, and that's something to note for the group here today. Project operations can be basically deployed as a Dataverse or a model-driven app only, where you don't have production scenarios integrated with, for example, supply chain. Or it can work in conjunction then with finance and supply chain to provide more advanced based capabilities for production and synchronization basically between the two environments. So what they've been working on here with this is, number one, they went through and they said everyone that was on project service automation, which was the predecessor to project operations, is going to be upgraded to project operations. And they set out a bunch of milestones for the wave releases where they said, we're going to take, for example, project service automation accounts and upgrade them to project operations if they don't have inventory. And they have less than 100 work breakdown structure items that they tackle as part of their business process. So they've been going in waves with this basically to make this functionality even better. So for this release, what they tackled then from a project ops perspective is they integrated approval processes then on the front end so that when we start interacting obviously with our model-driven app, that we've got this ability now to have modern approvals as part of that particular process. So that's a pretty big one that gets asked for almost every single time, where basically then you want to be able to drive, for example, an approval process for a project before you actually release it. Well, now you've got the ability really to go through those approval processes. Other areas as well, per diem, meals per day, per type, per trip, right? Or not having a meal reduction as part of your project when you're setting it up. We didn't have the per diem expense capability as part of it, so they've added that inside of here. In the non-stock scenarios, so, and that's those different scenarios I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier. Non-stock scenarios are where you just have the model-driven app, while we didn't have a pay when paid capability inside of there to drive that. So it's nice that they've now added that capability for non-finance and operations apps integrated scenarios for project operations. There's also been a couple of other things from a quality of life perspective update. An example of that is a transfer posting airlines to a new journal. When you're doing the integration between them and when you're posting, for example, hours, expenses, or journals, that originated inside of the project operations model-driven app, which is usually what the project managers and team is using to enter in time, expense, and all of that, right? Because the accounting now happens inside of the finance and operations side of this. Well, those items would come over, and imagine you forgot to, I don't know, on the project category, you forgot to set up the right costing or the right, accounts from a general ledger perspective, so that when you posted the accounting impact of it, it would fail and you couldn't do anything with the rest of the lines that were there. You basically had to fix that one and then hope it worked and keep reposting it, right? Well, now what they said is they're like, you know what, we'll just transfer the posting errors to a new journal like we have in many of our other areas, right? So that way everything that works, I don't have to pay any attention to, and anything that had an error, basically I'll go to that other journal and correct it. So a nice quality of life improvement there. We now also integrate with the quote versions because it's very common in projects to have multiple quotes and different variations of those quotes, right? So now we're looking at those quote versions also being supported from a project ops perspective as well. And really kind of finally here, when we talk about the PSA to PO upgrade, so that's the project service automation to the project operations upgrade, they're now in the final wave of that. So we should see less and less customers that are using project service automation, the predecessor, and now more customers that use what we call project operations, and they're doing now those large projects, so the ones that have complex work breakdown structures, that have an integration, for example, with finance or supply chain with PSA. Those are now what they're tackling as part of this last upgrade. So that way we will be able to start really investing even more now on the project operations platform moving forward here. So a lot of good improvements that we have then from a project ops perspective.
Yeah, and I will add to that just a little bit. I've been pretty heavy in the project management and accounting module within D365, and one thing that I'm noticing here with these past few releases into ProjOps is a lot of the functionality that you see within F&O, you're now starting to see that within project operations. The same thing with terminology as well. In those earlier versions, one form meant one thing and it was a little bit different between, but the terminology even now between fields and forms, F&O and project operations is getting very, very consistent as well.
Yep. And they're also starting to open this up a little bit more, Ted, too. There's so many features that we weren't able to cover. Like they've got an API now. So if you've got a project tool that you use for your scheduling, you can use that API now to create tasks and assignments and even contours inside of project operations. So it just, like I said, it's just becoming more and more inclusive and capable now that we don't have the PSA baggage, is kind of the way I would say it. And we can start focusing on really project operations and the scale of it moving forward here, which is pretty cool.